Janet Yamanaka Mello woke up in her sprawling San Antonio estate on August 29, 2023. By sunset, federal agents were seizing her 58-acre Maryland mansion, her fleet of 80 luxury vehicles, and over 1,500 pieces of designer jewelry. The 57-year-old former Army employee had spent 6 years living a double life, $108 million stolen from military families while she shopped for $900,000 jewelry hauls and collected properties across 5 states. But Janet's fall from grace was just one story. Tonight, we're counting down 7 wealthy Texas women whose empires crumbled overnight. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let me know, where are you watching from and what time is it where you are right now? From Fort Worth to San Antonio, from corporate boardrooms to federal courtrooms, these 7 women had it all. Multi-million-dollar properties, designer wardrobes, business empires, the kind of wealth most people only dream about. But behind the Instagram perfect facades and luxury lifestyles, each one was running a scheme that would cost them everything. Tonight's cases span from $350,000 to over $100 million. Real estate fraud, healthcare scams, pandemic relief schemes. Some of these women are serving their sentences right now. Others are waiting to learn their fate. One thing connects them all: they went from mansion to mugshot faster than you can imagine. We're starting small and building to the biggest theft in San Antonio history. Stick around, because what happened to our final case will shock you. Let's start in Dallas, where a trusted title company employee was about to betray everyone who depended on her. Case Hayshown. Constance Marie Kelly. Constance Marie Kelly had built a respectable career in Dallas real estate. At 56, she wasn't a flashy executive or a high-profile CEO. She was something more valuable in the world of property transactions. She was trusted. Kelly worked at American Title, one of the companies that handles the massive amounts of money that change hands when people buy and sell homes. If you've ever bought a house, you know how it works. You put down earnest money, you wire your closing costs. All of that money sits in what's called an escrow account, a protected holding place where funds wait until the deal closes. Title companies are the gatekeepers of these accounts. They're supposed to be neutral, trustworthy, almost like financial referees, making sure everyone gets paid what they're owed when the deal is done. Constance Kelly had access to those accounts. She understood the system inside and out. She knew when money came in, where it sat, and how it moved. Most importantly, she knew the vulnerabilities. And over time, Kelly stopped seeing herself as a gatekeeper and started seeing herself as someone with an opportunity. Kelly didn't work alone. She had a partner in crime, a man named Leonard James McMorris. Together, they developed a scheme that would rob families of their futures. The plan was simple in concept, but required insider knowledge to execute. Kelly would identify escrow accounts with significant balances. These were accounts holding down payments, closing costs, and funds that buyers had scraped together over years of saving. Money that represented dreams of home ownership. Money that people had borrowed from family members or taken from retirement accounts. Money that meant everything to them. Then, using her position and access, Kelly would initiate fraudulent transfers. She'd move funds out of the escrow accounts and into accounts she and McMorris controlled. The transactions were designed to look legitimate on paper, at least temporarily. They'd cover their tracks, falsify records, and hope that by the time anyone noticed the missing money, the trail would be too cold to follow. Over the course of their scheme, Kelly and McMorris stole more than $1.4 million. That's not just a number, that's dozens of families. Some victims lost their entire down payment. Others saw their closing delayed indefinitely while American Title tried to figure out where their money had gone. Some deals fell through completely, credit scores were damaged, dreams of home ownership evaporated. And through it all, Constance Kelly kept showing up to work, kept processing legitimate transactions, and kept up the appearance of being a trusted employee. The scheme worked for a while. But there's a fundamental problem with stealing money from escrow accounts eventually. That money has to go somewhere. Sellers expect to get paid. Lenders expect their liens to be satisfied. and when escrow accounts come up short, questions get asked. The unraveling began when discrepancies started appearing in American Title's books, missing funds, accounts that didn't balance, transactions that looked suspicious when examined closely. The company launched an internal investigation, and once they started pulling the thread, the whole scheme came apart. By November of 2016, the evidence was overwhelming. Constance Kelly pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Her co-conspirator, Leonard James McMorris, faced the same charges. The initial sentencing seemed almost lenient considering the scope of the crime. Kelly received 30 months in federal prison, but that wasn't the end of her legal troubles. Kelly's case dragged on through the appeals process and resentencing hearings. Then came April of 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic had shut down courtrooms across the country. Federal judges were scrambling to figure out how to continue administering justice while keeping people safe. And Constance Kelly found herself making history, not the kind anyone wants to make. On April 8, 2020, Kelly became the first person in Dallas federal court to be sentenced via video teleconference. Chief U.S. District Judge Barbara M. G. Lynn appeared on screen, and from her home or office somewhere safe from the virus spreading through the city, she handed down Kelly's final sentence, 46 months in federal prison, nearly 4 years behind bars. U.S. Attorney Erin Neely Cox issued a statement at the time. This defendant, who defrauded her employer out of more than $1 million, was sentenced via video teleconference. We are gratified the court is working with our office to ensure justice marches on, even amidst a pandemic. Today, Constance Marie Kelly and Leonard James McMorris are jointly and severally liable for more than $1.4 million in restitution. That legal language means each of them is responsible for the full amount. If one can't pay, the other is on the hook, and realistically, neither of them will ever be able to repay what they stole. McMorris received his own sentence, 30 months in federal prison. Both have likely completed or are near completing their time behind bars by now, but the consequences follow them forever. A federal fraud conviction doesn't just disappear, it shows up on background checks. It disqualifies you from certain jobs, especially anything involving trust or financial responsibility. It follows you when you try to rent an apartment, when you apply for loans, when you try to rebuild your life. For Kelly, the career she'd built over decades was destroyed in an instant. The trust she'd cultivated, the professional reputation she'd established, the comfortable life she created, all of it vanished the moment federal agents started asking questions about those missing escrow funds. And for the victims, some of whom lost their life savings, no amount of restitution will ever truly make them whole. The families who trusted American Title, who trusted the system, who did everything right and still got robbed, they're the ones who paid the real price. Some of them are still paying it. But if you think $1.4 million is shocking, wait until you hear about the woman who turned a title company position in South Texas into her personal ATM. Case #2 Mayela Saby Cantu M. Callan. Mayela Saby Cantu was 55 years old and working at a title company in McAllen, Texas. If you're not familiar with the geography, McAllen sits right on the U.S.-Mexico border, about 70 miles west of the Gulf of Mexico. It's one of the fastest growing cities in America, fueled by international trade, cross-border commerce, and a real estate market that's been booming for years. Properties change hands constantly. Businesses expand, families buy homes, and every single one of those transactions flows through title companies. In the real estate world, title companies are the gatekeepers of legitimacy. They verify that the person selling you a property actually owns it. They make sure there aren't hidden liens or claims against the property. They hold the money during transactions to ensure everyone gets paid correctly. When you're buying a house, you're trusting the title company with potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars. You're trusting them to make sure everything is legal, proper, and safe. Mayela Cantu had that position of trust. She wasn't just answering phones or filing paperwork. She was involved in the core functions of the business, the parts where money moves, where documents get signed, where deals get finalized. And for years, she did her job competently and professionally. But sometime around November of 2020, Cantu decided that facilitating legitimate real estate deals wasn't enough. She wanted more. What Mayela Cantu did next wasn't a crime of opportunity or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was calculated. This was sophisticated. This required planning, technical knowledge, and a complete disregard for the people whose lives she was about to destroy. The scheme started with email. Not just any email, fake email addresses designed to look identical to legitimate lien holders. In real estate transactions, lien holders are entities that have a legal claim on a property, usually mortgage companies or banks. When a property sells, those liens have to be paid off. The title company contacts the lien holder, gets a payoff amount, and wires that money as part of the closing process. Cantu realized she could exploit this system. She directed others, whether co-conspirators or unwitting accomplices, we may never know the full extent, to create fraudulent email addresses that closely resembled legitimate lien holder contact information. Maybe it was a single letter different, maybe it was a subtle domain variation, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking carefully. Then, using these fake email accounts, Cantu would send false payoff amounts via interstate wires. Here's where it gets especially brazen. In one notable case, her scheme caused a title company to improperly disburse more than $350,000. Think about that. Someone's mortgage payoff should have been, let's say, $50,000, but the fake email from the lien holder says it's $400,000. The title company, trusting the communication, wires the inflated amount. The extra $350,000, that money disappears into accounts controlled by Cantu and possibly others. But she didn't stop with fake lien holders. Cantu facilitated additional fraudulent property transactions that showed just how deep her corruption ran. She arranged closings on properties that had already been sold. Imagine that you think you're buying a house, you wire your money, you show up to closing, and the property isn't even available because it was sold weeks ago to someone else. Cantu also accepted undisclosed cash payments on the side. These were under-the-table deals where buyers or sellers would pay her directly to look the other way, falsify documents, or push through transactions that shouldn't have been approved. From November 2020 until her arrest, Cantu defrauded buyers and lenders in multiple property transactions. Each one was a family trying to buy a home, an investor trying to build wealth, or a lender trying to protect their investment. Each one trusted the system. Each one trusted that the title company employee processing their deal was acting in good faith. By concealing the true nature of these deals, Cantu caused significant financial harm to everyone involved. Buyers lost their down payments, lenders lost their security. Legitimate sellers didn't get paid properly. And the ripple effect spread throughout the McAllen real estate community, deals falling through, escrow accounts coming up short, banks demanding explanations, and families left financially devastated. Eventually, the discrepancies became impossible to hide. When hundreds of thousands of dollars go missing, people notice. When property transactions don't add up, investigations begin. Federal authorities, likely the FBI working in conjunction with local law enforcement, started building a case against Mayela Cantu. The evidence was overwhelming. Fake email accounts traced back to her sphere of influence. Wire transfers that made no sense unless you understood the fraud behind them. Victims coming forward with stories of closings gone wrong, money vanished, and deals that should never have happened. And at the center of it all was Cantu, using her position of trust to orchestrate a scheme that had stolen over $350,000. On December 20th, 2024, just weeks ago, Mayela Saby Cantu stood before Chief U.S. District Judge Randy Crane and pleaded guilty, not to a minor offense or a technicality. She pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud. That's a federal felony. That's the kind of charge that comes with serious prison time and follows you for the rest of your life. The guilty plea meant Cantu was admitting to everything. She was acknowledging that she conspired with others that she used interstate wire communications to execute fraud and that she did it knowingly and intentionally. There would be no trial, no jury, no chance to claim innocence or misunderstanding. She was guilty, and now she had to face the consequences. Chief U.S. District Judge Randy Crane sentenced Mayela Cantu to 24 months in federal prison. That's 2 years behind bars. But the punishment doesn't end when she walks out of prison. She'll also face 3 years of supervised release, meaning she'll be monitored, restricted in where she can go and what she can do, and one violation could send her right back to prison. Right now, Cantu has been permitted to remain on bond while she awaits transfer to a Federal Bureau of Prisons facility. That's the limbo period between sentencing and incarceration. She's probably at home, saying goodbye to family, getting her affairs in order, and counting down the days until she has to report. Soon, she'll receive notification of which federal prison she's been assigned to. Then she'll have to voluntarily surrender herself or be taken into custody. The restitution orders will haunt her for decades. Over $350,000 that she'll be legally obligated to repay to victims. Even if she makes payments for the rest of her life, she'll likely never pay off that debt. Wage garnishments, tax refund seizures, asset liquidation. The federal government doesn't forget, and they don't forgive financial crimes easily. But beyond the financial and legal consequences, think about what Mayela Cantu destroyed. She worked in an industry built entirely on trust. Title companies exist because people need a neutral third party they can rely on during one of the biggest financial transactions of their lives. Cantu took that trust and weaponized it. She turned her position into a tool for theft, and in doing so, she didn't just hurt her victims financially, she made them doubt the entire system. Every person who lost money in one of her fraudulent deals now approaches real estate transactions with suspicion. Every email from a lien holder gets scrutinized. Every wire transfer gets double-checked. The damage extends far beyond the $350,000 she stole. $350,000 destroyed Mayela Cantu's life. But in San Antonio, another woman was thinking much, much bigger. Case #3. Samantha L. Mueting. Samantha L. Mueting wanted everyone to believe she was a titan of commercial real estate. Not just successful, globally dominant. Her company was called I-Corp, and if you believed her pitch, I-Corp was one of the most powerful real estate firms in the world. According to Mueting, I-Corp operated in 64 countries. She claimed the company had 156 offices spread across the globe: New York, London, Singapore, Dubai, you name it. But the numbers got even more impressive. Mueting told potential investors that I-Corp managed a commercial real estate investment fund worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Not millions, not even tens of billions. Hundreds of billions. The kind of money that would put I-Corp in the same league as the biggest investment firms on Wall Street. And the workforce? Mueting claimed I-Corp employed anywhere from 1,500 to 5,000 people, depending on which presentation you saw. Project managers, analysts, leasing agents, property managers. A global workforce supporting this massive empire. When you looked at Mueting's presentations, everything seemed legitimate. Professional slideshows, glossy brochures, detailed financial projections. She spoke with confidence about market trends, cap rates, and international property portfolios. She knew the language of commercial real estate inside and out. And for investors looking for opportunities in the lucrative world of commercial property, I-Corp seemed like exactly the kind of established, well-connected firm you'd want to partner with. Potential investors looked at her claims, her professionalism, her apparent success, and they believed her. They saw an opportunity to get in on the ground floor of deals managed by a global powerhouse. They saw a chance to diversify their portfolios with commercial real estate investments backed by a company with offices in 64 countries. They opened their checkbooks and wired their money, trusting that Samantha L., Mueting, and I-Corp would deliver returns on their investments. It was all a lie. Every single word of it. I-Corp wasn't a global commercial real estate empire. It wasn't even a legitimate small business. It was smoke and mirrors. It was a fantasy constructed entirely to separate investors from their money. The truth was pathetic compared to the claims. Icor's official business address, the address listed on all those professional documents and glossy brochures, was a postal box at a UPS store. Not a prestigious downtown San Antonio office building, not even a modest suite in a suburban office park. A mailbox, the kind you rent for $19 a month. The workforce that supposedly numbered in the thousands. At its peak, Icor never employed more than 6 people at any given time. 6. And most of those were likely Mueting herself, her co-conspirator, and a handful of people who may or may not have known they were part of a massive fraud. The offices in 64 countries, they didn't exist. The hundreds of billions under management, completely fabricated. The global reach, the institutional credibility, the track record of success, all of it was fiction. Samantha Mueting had created an elaborate facade, and she'd done it well enough to fool sophisticated investors who should have known better. She didn't work alone. Her partner in this scheme was a man named Josephus Delat. Together, Mueting and Delat used Icor as a vehicle to defraud investors of more than $2.1 million. That's the documented amount. The money they can prove was stolen. The actual total might be higher. Here's how they operated. They targeted people looking for legitimate commercial real estate investment opportunities. Maybe someone who'd made money in their career and wanted to diversify. Maybe a retired professional with a nest egg looking for steady returns. Maybe a small business owner looking to invest profits. These weren't naive marks, they were intelligent people who did their due diligence. But Mueting and Delat's presentation was so polished, so professional, so convincing that it passed scrutiny. Investors would wire money for what they thought was stakes in commercial properties or shares in Icor's investment funds. Mueting and Delat would provide documentation, contracts, investment summaries, projected returns. Everything looked legitimate on paper. But that money wasn't going into real estate investments. It was going straight into Mueting and Delat's pockets. Some victims realized something was wrong when promised returns never materialized. Others got suspicious when they tried to get more information about their investments and couldn't get straight answers. A few started asking harder questions, wanting to visit properties, wanting to meet with other partners, wanting to see audited financials. That's when the whole scheme started to crack. By 2021, enough victims had come forward that federal investigators couldn't ignore the pattern. When they started digging into Icor, the house of cards collapsed immediately. Bank records didn't match the claims. The supposed offices didn't exist. The properties in the portfolio were either non-existent or owned by completely different entities. The entire company was a shell game. Samantha L. Mueting was indicted on multiple federal charges, 1 count of mail fraud conspiracy because she'd used the US Postal Service to send fraudulent investment documents to victims, and 8 counts of wire fraud because she'd used interstate wire communications, including phone calls, emails, and wire transfers to execute the scheme. Each count carried serious prison time. As the evidence mounted and her legal options dwindled, Mueting eventually pleaded guilty. It seemed like she'd accepted responsibility, acknowledged the harm she'd caused, and was ready to face the consequences. But then came the sentencing hearing, and Mueting tried one last desperate maneuver. At the last possible moment, she attempted to withdraw her guilty plea. This is an extremely rare move, and it almost never works. Essentially, Mueting was trying to say, I know I admitted to all of this, but I changed my mind. I want to take it back and go to trial instead. Her attorneys made various arguments for why the plea should be withdrawn, but the judge wasn't buying it. The federal judge presiding over the case reviewed the motion, reviewed the evidence, and flatly rejected Mueting's attempt to withdraw her plea. The guilty plea would stand. She had admitted to the crimes, and now she would be sentenced for them. The judge sentenced Samantha L. Mueting to 87 months in federal prison. That's more than 7 years behind bars. It's not a life sentence, but for a woman who'd spent years living off stolen investor money, 7 years in federal prison is a devastating fall. Mueting is currently serving that sentence right now. She's somewhere in the federal prison system, likely in a low-security facility for white-collar criminals. Every day, she wakes up in a cell instead of in whatever comfortable home she bought with her victims' money. Every day, she's reminded that the fake empire she built came with very real consequences. But the financial consequences extend far beyond her prison sentence. Mueting and Delat are jointly and severally liable for more than $2.1 million in restitution. That means each of them owes the full amount to the victims. If Mueting can't pay, Delat is on the hook for it all, and vice versa. And given that neither of them appears to have legitimate wealth, everything they had came from the fraud, the victims are unlikely to ever be fully repaid. Speaking of Delat, his sentence was dramatically different. While Mueting got 87 months in federal prison, Delat received 5 years of probation, no prison time at all. It's possible he cooperated with prosecutors. It's possible his role in the scheme was less central than Mueting's. Or it's possible his attorneys negotiated a better deal. Whatever the reason, the disparity in sentencing shows that the justice system viewed Mueting as the primary architect of this fraud. During the court proceedings, victims testified about the impact of Mueting's crimes. One father stood up and described how Mueting had cost him thousands of dollars, money he'd saved and invested in good faith, money he'd never see again. Judge Davis in Bexar County acknowledged these testimonies, recognized the harm that had been done, and made sure the sentencing reflected the seriousness of the crime. Samantha Mueting created a fake empire out of thin air. She spun a story so convincing that intelligent, cautious investors believed it. She printed brochures about offices that didn't exist, managed funds that were fictional, and built a reputation on lies. For a while, it worked. She lived off other people's money, maintained the facade, and probably convinced herself she could keep it going forever. But lies have a shelf life, and when the truth came out, everything collapsed. The fake offices disappeared because they never existed, the global workforce vanished because it was never real, and Samantha L. Mueting went from CEO of a supposed global empire to federal inmate number serving 7 years in prison. Samantha Mueting faked an empire to steal $2 million. Our next case involves a real business, a real CEO, and a betrayal that left employees without the one thing they needed most. Case #4. Belinda Jo Juarez. Belinda Jo Juarez had made it. At 53 years old, she wasn't just successful, she was at the top. Juarez was the CEO and majority owner of Superior Home Health Service, a healthcare company based in San Antonio with additional locations throughout the region. This wasn't some small startup operating out of a spare bedroom. This was a legitimate, established business providing essential services to patients who needed care in their own homes. Home health services are critical in healthcare. These are the nurses, aides, and therapists who go into patients' homes to provide medical care, help with daily activities, and monitor chronic conditions. It's demanding work, it's often underpaid, and the people who do it are some of the most dedicated professionals in healthcare. They work long hours, deal with difficult situations, and genuinely care about their patients. Belinda Juarez employed dozens of these healthcare workers, and one of the things that made Superior Home Health Service attractive as an employer was the benefits package. Healthcare workers understand better than anyone how important health insurance is. They see every day what happens to people who can't afford medical care, who delay treatment because of costs, who end up in crisis because they don't have coverage. So when they're looking for jobs, they pay attention to benefits, and Superior Home Health Service offered health insurance. Employees could enroll in the company's health insurance plan. Every pay period, their contributions would be automatically withheld from their paychecks just like at any other job. They'd get their insurance cards, their policy information, their network provider lists. They'd know they were covered. They'd know that if they got sick, if their kids needed a doctor, if there was an emergency, their insurance would be there. That peace of mind was part of why people chose to work for Belinda Juarez. She had built something real, a functional business providing important services, employing good people, and operating successfully in the competitive healthcare industry. But sometime in 2017, Belinda Juarez made a decision that would destroy everything. Beginning in August of 2017, Juarez caused her company to stop remitting insurance payments to the insurance providers. Let me explain what that means. When you have employer-sponsored health insurance, your employer is supposed to collect your premium contributions and then send those payments along with the employer's portion to the insurance company. That's how the coverage stays active. That's how claims get paid. That's how the whole system works. Belinda Juarez stopped making those payments. But here's where it gets truly despicable. She continued to withhold the contributions from her employees' paychecks. Every pay period, money was still being deducted for health insurance. Her workers looked at their pay stubs and saw the deduction. They assumed everything was fine. They had no reason to think otherwise. Meanwhile, the insurance providers weren't getting paid. After months of non-payment, the insurance companies did what they're contractually required to do. They cancelled the contracts. Superior Home Health Services employees no longer had active health insurance coverage, but nobody told them. Belinda Juarez certainly didn't tell them. She just kept taking their money. Imagine being one of those employees. You're a home health nurse making maybe $40,000 or $50,000 a year. You're contributing a couple $100s per paycheck for family health insurance coverage. You do this for months, maybe years. Then one day, your kid gets sick. You take them to the doctor. You hand over your insurance card at the front desk, and the receptionist comes back and says, "I'm sorry, but this policy shows as inactive. It was cancelled months ago." That's when the nightmare begins. You call the insurance company. They tell you the employer stopped paying premiums. You call your employer. Maybe you get vague explanations. Maybe you get no explanation at all. Meanwhile, you're sitting in a doctor's office with a sick child and you just found out you have no insurance coverage. The visit you thought would cost a $20 copay is now going to cost hundreds out of pocket. And then you realize if the coverage was cancelled months ago, what about that emergency room visit last month? What about that prescription you filled? What about the specialist appointment? Some of Belinda Juarez's employees incurred significant medical cost expenses for themselves or their family members because they believed they had active insurance coverage. They went to doctors, they filled prescriptions, they got treatments, all of it happened while their insurance was actually inactive, cancelled months earlier due to non-payment. These healthcare workers, people who dedicated their careers to caring for others, suddenly found themselves facing medical bills they couldn't afford. Bills that should have been covered by the insurance they'd been paying for all along. And where was the money going? Into Belinda Juarez's pockets. She was taking employee contributions meant for health insurance and using that money for who knows what. Personal expenses, business expenses. It didn't matter. It wasn't hers to take. Every dollar withheld from an employee's paycheck for insurance was money that should have gone to the insurance company. Instead, Juarez was essentially stealing from her own workers. But the fraud didn't stop there. Juarez also committed tax evasion. While she was embezzling employee health insurance premiums, she was also hiding income from the IRS. The government wasn't getting the tax revenue it was owed, and the employees weren't getting the insurance coverage they'd paid for. Belinda Juarez was committing fraud on multiple fronts, betraying everyone who'd trusted her, her employees, the insurance companies, and the federal government. Eventually, the complaints and discrepancies caught up with her. Maybe it was employees who discovered their coverage had been cancelled. Maybe it was insurance companies pursuing unpaid premiums. Maybe it was the IRS noticing irregularities in Superior Home Health Services tax filings. However it started, federal investigators began looking into Belinda Jo Juarez's business practices. What they found was clear-cut fraud. Bank records showed money being withheld from employee paychecks for insurance. Those same records showed that money never being forwarded to insurance providers. Documentation showed insurance policies being cancelled due to non-payment. Employee complaints showed people discovering they had no coverage despite paying for it. And tax records showed Juarez hiding income and evading her tax obligations. The evidence was overwhelming. When federal prosecutors brought charges against Belinda Jo Juarez, she faced counts of embezzling employee health insurance premiums and tax evasion. These are federal crimes. These are the kinds of charges that come with prison time and destroy your life. Juarez pleaded guilty. She admitted to what she'd done. She acknowledged that she'd stolen from her employees, that she'd left them exposed and vulnerable, that she'd pocketed money that wasn't hers. And on January 8th, 2025, just a few weeks ago, she appeared in federal court in San Antonio for sentencing. Belinda Jo Juarez was sentenced to 36 months in federal prison. That's 3 years behind bars. For a 53-year-old woman who'd been running a business, living comfortably, and enjoying the fruits of her success, the idea of spending the next 3 years in a federal prison cell must have been crushing. But that's exactly what's ahead of her. In addition to prison time, Juarez faces substantial financial penalties and restitution payments. She'll have to pay back the money she stole, money that should have gone to insurance premiums, money that should have been reported as income. The federal government doesn't forgive financial crimes. They'll garnish wages, seize assets, and pursue payment for as long as it takes. But you can't measure the real damage of Belinda Juarez's crime in dollars and cents. Think about what she did to her employees. These were healthcare workers, nurses, aides, therapists who chose to work for her. They trusted her. They showed up every day, took care of patients, did difficult and important work, and in exchange, they expected basic things like being paid fairly and having the benefits they were promised. Instead, they got betrayed in one of the cruelest ways possible. Healthcare workers understand the value of health insurance better than almost anyone. They see patients every day who suffer because they can't afford care. They see people skip medications because of the cost. They see families destroyed by medical debt. So when healthcare workers pay for insurance, they're buying peace of mind. They're protecting themselves and their families from the financial catastrophe that comes with serious illness or injury. Belinda Juarez took that peace of mind away. She left her employees exposed. She put their families at risk. Some of them incurred medical debts that would take years to pay off. Some of them delayed necessary care because they couldn't afford out-of-pocket costs. Some of them are still dealing with the financial and emotional fallout of discovering that the insurance they'd been paying for didn't actually exist. And the trust violation runs even deeper. These employees worked in healthcare because they cared about helping people. They chose to work for Superior Home Health Service because they believed in the mission. And their CEO, the person who was supposed to be leading that mission, who was supposed to be protecting them, was stealing from them the entire time. She was taking money directly out of their paychecks and pocketing it while they continued to show up, work hard, and take care of patients. Belinda Jo Juarez will serve her 3 years in prison. She'll pay her restitution, she'll complete her sentence, and eventually be released. But her employees will remember this betrayal for the rest of their lives. Some of them are probably still paying off medical bills that should have been covered by insurance they paid for. Some of them probably still feel angry every time they think about the months or years they worked for her, not knowing they were being robbed. And all of them learned a painful lesson about trust, exploitation, and how even in the caring profession of healthcare, there are people who will take advantage of the vulnerable. Employee fraud is devastating. But our next case shows what happens when a couple turns the dream of homeownership into a nightmare worth millions. Case #5. Raquelle Judge. Raquelle Judge and her husband Christopher seemed like the perfect couple to turn your house into a home. If you spent any time on social media in the Fort Worth area between 2020 and 2023, you probably saw their content, beautiful before and after photos, stunning kitchen renovations, custom home builds that looked like they belonged in magazines, and at the center of it all were Raquelle and Christopher, a photogenic, charismatic couple who presented themselves as the next Chip and Joanna Gaines. For anyone not familiar, Chip and Joanna Gaines became household names through their HGTV show Fixer Upper. They turned home renovation into aspirational entertainment, taking rundown houses in Waco, Texas, and transforming them into dream homes. They built an empire on the idea that with the right vision, the right team, and the right budget, anyone could have the custom home they'd always wanted. They became synonymous with wholesome family values, craftsmanship, and making dreams come true. Raquelle and Christopher Judge wanted that same image. They operated as Judge DFW LLC, marketing themselves as a full-service design and build company. They weren't just contractors, they positioned themselves as a one-stop shop for custom architecture, interior design, and construction services. Their social media presence was polished and professional. They posted regularly about projects in progress, shared design inspiration, and cultivated a following of people who dreamed of building or renovating their own homes. And the pitch was compelling. The judges offered below-market bids, prices that were noticeably lower than other contractors in the competitive North Texas market. They promised timelines of 4 to 6 months, which is reasonable for many renovation and custom-build projects. They emphasized that Christopher was an architect, giving them an edge over contractors who had to outsource design work. Everything about their branding was aspirational. They made you believe that your dream home was achievable, affordable, and just a contract signature away. For families looking to build or renovate, Judge DFW seemed like the perfect choice. Lower prices than competitors. Beautiful examples of past work on social media. A personable couple who seemed genuinely invested in making their clients' dreams come true. What could go wrong? Everything. Everything could go wrong. Because from August of 2020 to January of 2023, Raquelle and Christopher Judge weren't running a legitimate construction business. They were running an elaborate fraud scheme that would destroy the lives of more than 40 families. Here's how it worked. The scheme started with Christopher Judge's central lie: he wasn't an architect. He had no architectural license. He had no formal training or credentials. But he presented himself as a licensed architect anyway, and that claim gave Judge DFW credibility. Clients thought they were working with a qualified professional who could design their homes and oversee construction from concept to completion. The judges would present potential clients with below-market bids. If other contractors were quoting $150,000 for a renovation, Judge DFW might come in at $125,000. That price difference was enough to be attractive without seeming suspiciously low. Families on tight budgets saw an opportunity to get their dream home for less. Families with more resources saw a chance to upgrade their plans or allocate money to better finishes and furnishings. Once victims signed design and build contracts, the judges required large installment payments. This is somewhat normal in construction. Contractors need money up front for materials, permits, and subcontractor deposits. But the amounts the judges demanded were substantial, and they required multiple payments as projects progressed, or rather, as projects were supposed to progress. Because here's where the fraud became devastating. The judges would start construction barely. They'd hire low-quality subcontractors, often the cheapest they could find. They'd begin demolition or rough framing. They'd do just enough work to make it look like the project was moving forward. Then the excuses would start. There's a delay with the permit. The subcontractor had an emergency. We're waiting on a material shipment. Weather pushed us back a few weeks. Meanwhile, the judges were demanding more installment payments. They'd tell clients that the project was stalled because they needed the next payment to bring in more workers or order materials. Desperate to see their projects completed, victims would make another payment, and another, and another. But the money wasn't going to subcontractors or materials. The judges were operating a classic Ponzi-style scheme. They were commingling funds, using money from one victim to buy materials for a completely different project. Money that was supposed to go toward building the Smith family's kitchen was being used to start framing the Johnson family's addition. Money for the Johnson addition was paying for the Martinez family's materials. The whole operation was a shell game, with the judges constantly shuffling money around to maintain the illusion that multiple projects were progressing simultaneously. And when subcontractors did show up, they often didn't get paid. The judges would hire workers, have them do a few days or weeks of work, and then either pay them late or not at all. Unpaid subcontractors would walk off jobs, leaving projects half-finished. Word spread in the North Texas construction community: don't work for Judge DFW, you won't get paid. This made it even harder for the judges to find quality workers, so they'd hire increasingly desperate and unqualified contractors, which meant even the work that did get done was substandard. Over the course of their scheme, the judges defrauded more than 40 victims across 6 Texas counties. At least 24 separate construction projects were involved. The total fraud exceeded $4.8 million. $4.8 million stolen from families who just wanted a home. Let me tell you about one specific victim. He was a former police officer with 13 years of service. He and his wife hired the judges to remodel their home in Euless. They paid nearly $200,000 in installment payments. The judges promised the project would take 4 to 5 months. Instead, it dragged on for many more months. During that time, the victim, his wife, and their 3 children couldn't live in their house because of the construction. They had to rent an apartment. Every month, they were paying both rent and their mortgage. They were hemorrhaging money, living in cramped temporary housing, and watching their dream renovation turn into a nightmare. When the work finally reached a point where the family could move back in, they discovered the extent of the damage. Within weeks, tiles started cracking, floors were cracking. The kitchen floor was actually sinking into the foundation. Everything the judges had done, every cut corner, every unqualified subcontractor, every rush job was falling apart. The former police officer eventually filed a civil lawsuit and hired an independent inspector. That inspector confirmed what the family already suspected: the work was so defective, so poorly executed, that it wasn't just cosmetic. The house was structurally unsound in places. It was unsafe. This family had to spend tens of thousands of dollars just to make their home safe enough to live in, and they estimate it will take tens of thousands more to actually fix all the problems the judges created. $200,000 paid to the judges, tens of thousands more spent fixing their work, months of living in an apartment while paying a mortgage, the stress on the family, the financial strain, the shattered dreams of what their home was supposed to be. And they were just one victim. Multiply that story by 40. Families left with half-demolished houses, projects abandoned at critical stages, shoddy work that created safety hazards, subcontractors who walked off jobs because they weren't getting paid, permits that were never pulled, inspections that never happened, properties that were left in worse condition than when the project started. Some families were forced to hire new contractors and essentially start over, paying twice for the same work. Some couldn't afford to fix the problems and had to live in partially completed, defective homes. Some lost their houses entirely because they'd borrowed against them to pay the judges and couldn't keep up with payments once the money was gone. The scheme should have ended much sooner. In May of 2022, 8 months before the fraud finally stopped, the Texas Board of Architectural Examiners issued Christopher Judge a formal warning. They told him explicitly that he was violating Texas law by presenting himself as a licensed architect when he had no such license. This was an official government agency telling him to stop. He didn't stop. Neither did Raquelle. The fraud continued for another 8 months, from May 2022 until January of 2023. More victims, more stolen money, more destroyed homes and shattered dreams. All of it happening after the state had officially warned them to stop. Eventually, the complaints became impossible to ignore. Victims started comparing notes on social media and discovering they'd all been scammed by the same couple. Local police departments started receiving reports. The FBI got involved. The Euless Police Department conducted a detailed investigation, and when federal agents and local detectives looked at Judge DFW's financial records, the fraud was blatant. Bank records showed the commingling of funds, victims' installment payments going into one account and then being used for unrelated expenses, and the personal spending was particularly galling. The judges had spent approximately $865,000 of company funds, money stolen from victims, on personal expenses. $96,000 went toward building their own $613,000 home in Keller, Texas. While their victims were living in half-finished houses or paying rent plus mortgage, the judges were building their own custom home with stolen money. They spent $82,000 on Amazon purchases, $10,000 on plastic surgery, $65,000 on legal fees, probably to fight the civil lawsuits that were starting to pile up. Money that should have been going to subcontractors, to materials, to finishing their clients' projects was instead funding the judge's comfortable lifestyle. On December 17, 2024, Raquelle Judge appeared in federal court and pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud. 2 weeks later, on December 30th, Christopher Judge entered his own guilty plea to the same charge. They weren't going to trial. They weren't going to claim innocence or misunderstanding. They admitted what they'd done. Christopher Judge faces up to 20 years in federal prison. His sentencing is scheduled for May 12, 2026, about 4 months from now. Raquelle Judge faces up to 5 years in federal prison. Her sentencing is coming up even sooner, April 14th, 2026. That's less than 3 months away. Right now, both of them are out on bond, waiting to learn exactly how many years they'll spend behind bars. In addition to prison time, both will face massive restitution obligations. They'll be jointly liable for the $4.8 million they stole, plus additional amounts for specific victims who can document their losses. These restitution orders will follow them for the rest of their lives. Wage garnishments, asset seizures. They'll never be able to escape the financial consequences of what they did. But for the victims, restitution payments from the judges won't come close to making them whole. That former police officer is still paying to fix his house. Other families are still dealing with the structural problems, the code violations, the unsafe conditions created by the judge's shoddy work. Some have medical debt from stress-related illnesses. Some have marriage problems from the financial strain. Some have children who remember those months living in apartments, watching their parents stress about money, wondering why their house was never finished. The emotional toll goes beyond dollars. These families trusted the judges. They invited them into their lives. They shared their dreams and their budgets. They made themselves vulnerable in the way you do when you're building or renovating a home. You're literally deconstructing the place where you live, trusting that someone will put it back together better than before. And the judges exploited that trust. They took people's dreams and turned them into nightmares. They took people's money and spent it on themselves. They left behind a trail of broken homes and broken families. $5 million in home renovation fraud destroyed dozens of families. But that number is about to sound small because our next case involves a pandemic relief scheme that made national headlines. Case #6, Stephanie Hockridge. Stephanie Hockridge wasn't always a fraudster. In fact, for most of her career, she was on the right side of the camera literally. From 2011 to 2018, Hockridge was a familiar face across the Phoenix area as a news anchor for ABC 15. If you lived in Arizona during those years, you probably saw her delivering the evening news, covering local stories, and building the kind of public trust that comes with being a television journalist. That career gave her something valuable beyond a salary. It gave her credibility. When you've been a news anchor, people recognize you. They associate you with authority, trustworthiness, and professionalism. Even after Hockridge left ABC 15 in 2018, that credibility didn't disappear. It was an asset she carried with her into whatever came next. And what came next was a pandemic. In March of 2020, COVID-19 shut down the world economy. Businesses closed, millions of people lost their jobs. The federal government scrambled to create emergency relief programs, and one of the biggest was the Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP. These were forgivable loans designed to help small businesses keep employees on payroll during the lockdowns. If you used the money correctly, the loan would be forgiven entirely. It was free money for businesses that needed it. But administering billions of dollars in loans to millions of small businesses required an infrastructure that didn't exist. The Small Business Administration couldn't process that volume of applications on its own, so they partnered with banks and, critically, with fintech companies, financial technology startups that could handle large volumes of applications quickly. In April of 2020, just weeks after the pandemic shutdowns began, Stephanie Hockridge and her husband Nathan Reese co-founded a company called Blueacorn. The pitch was simple. They would help small businesses navigate the complicated PPP application process and secure the loans they needed to survive. It seemed like a noble mission. Small businesses were desperate. The application process was confusing. And here were these entrepreneurs, including a former TV news anchor, offering to help. Blue Acorn grew explosively. By the end of 2021, the company had processed $12 billion in PPP loans. $12 billion. To put that in perspective, Blue Acorn facilitated almost 3 times as many PPP loans in 2021 as JP Morgan Chase and Bank of America combined. This wasn't just a successful startup, it was a juggernaut. And as a lender service provider, Blue Acorn received fees for each loan they processed. Those fees came from the Small Business Administration taxpayer money designed to incentivize companies to help distribute relief funds quickly. Hockridge and Rice walked away with approximately $300 million in processing fees. $300 million. They'd gone from launching a startup in April of 2020 to becoming extraordinarily wealthy by the end of 2021. They moved to Puerto Rico, a common tax haven strategy for the newly wealthy. From the outside, it looked like they'd built something incredible during a crisis. But federal investigators were starting to ask questions. Blue Acorn wasn't just helping small businesses, it was actively helping applicants commit fraud. And more than that, Hockridge and her co-conspirators were fabricating documents themselves to inflate loan amounts and maximize their fees. The scheme involved multiple layers of fraud. At the most basic level, Hockridge and her team were altering financial documents to make applicants appear to qualify for larger loans than they actually deserved. They were using Photoshop, and we know this because FBI agents found internal messages where Hockridge literally blamed her husband's poor Photoshop skills when a lending institution rejected an application because the altered documents were too obvious. They would take a legitimate tax form showing someone earned $57,000 and change it to show $157,000. A higher reported income meant a higher loan amount. A higher loan amount meant more fees for Blue Acorn. They fabricated payroll records showing businesses had employees they didn't actually have. They created false bank statements showing revenue that didn't exist, and they charged borrowers kickbacks based on a percentage of the loan amount, which was explicitly prohibited under SBA rules. But Hockridge didn't just run a standard fraudulent lending operation. She created a premium service called VIF, or Play on VIP. This was a specialized tier where borrowers paid extra for personalized assistance. And what did that assistance include? Coaching on how to submit false applications. Hockridge recruited referral agents who would actively teach borrowers how to lie on their applications, how to inflate their payroll numbers, how to fabricate employee counts, how to create fake revenue documentation. Internal evidence later obtained by congressional investigators painted a damning picture. Slack messages, the internal communication platform Blue Acorn used, showed Hockridge giving explicit instructions to prioritize VIPPP clients over regular applicants. In some messages, she told staff to delete non-VIPPP loan applications entirely to focus resources on the premium, high-fee clients. This wasn't just negligence or poor oversight. This was deliberate, systematic fraud. The numbers were staggering. In total, Hockridge and her co-conspirators processed more than $63 million in fraudulent PPP loans. These were applications they knew contained materially false information. Applications for businesses that didn't exist or didn't qualify. Applications with fabricated documents and inflated numbers. And every single one of those fraudulent loans generated fees that went to Blue Acorn and ultimately to Hockridge and Rice. The house of cards started collapsing when the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Crisis released a 129-page report examining PPP fraud. The report specifically called out Blue Acorn for failing to implement effective safeguards while profiting massively from the program. Congressional investigators found that Blue Acorn's loan reviewers reported receiving poor training and being pressured to push through applications even when supporting documents appeared inauthentic. The report revealed that Blue Acorn had processed nearly 3 times as many loans in 2021 as the biggest banks in America. That alone raised red flags. But when investigators looked deeper, they found the systematic fraud, the altered documents, the VIPPP scheme, the kickbacks to borrowers. The congressional report was referred to the Department of Justice for criminal investigation. Federal prosecutors and FBI agents began building a case. They subpoenaed Blue Acorn's records. They interviewed victims, both borrowers who'd been coached to commit fraud and legitimate small businesses whose applications had been deleted or delayed, while VIPPP clients got priority. They examined Hockridge's computer and found files with both original and altered versions of the same tax documents. They found the Slack messages with her instructions to staff. They found evidence of the kickback payments. On June 20th, 2025, after a week-long trial in Fort Worth, a federal jury heard all the evidence. Prosecutors presented testimony from FBI agents who detailed the document fabrication. They showed the altered tax forms. They played recordings and showed messages where Hockridge discussed the scheme. They brought in witnesses who testified about the pressure to approve fraudulent applications. The trial had some emotional moments. On day 2, FBI agent Colin Friedman testified about the arrest of Nathan Race, Hockridge's husband. As he recounted the details, Hockridge, sitting at the defense table, began sobbing. She briefly left the courtroom, overcome with emotion. It was a rare moment of visible distress from someone who'd maintained a composed public persona throughout the investigation. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict: guilty on 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The jury acquitted her on 4 separate wire fraud counts, perhaps finding that while she'd conspired to commit fraud, prosecutors hadn't proven she'd directly executed certain specific fraudulent transactions herself. But the conspiracy conviction was enough. During the trial, it also came out that after getting most of their PPP loans forgiven ironically, loans they'd helped others fraudulently obtain, Hockridge and Reese had moved to Puerto Rico. It was a tax strategy, but it also looked like they were distancing themselves from the scene of the crime. On November 21st, 2025, just weeks ago, Stephanie Hockridge appeared in federal court for sentencing. The judge had discretion to sentence her anywhere from probation to 20 years in prison. Prosecutors argued for significant prison time. The defense argued for leniency, claiming Hockridge had tried to help businesses during a crisis and that the fraud charges were overblown. The judge sentenced Stephanie Hockridge to 10 years in federal prison, a decade behind bars. She was also ordered to pay over $63 million in restitution to the Small Business Administration, money that was supposed to help struggling businesses, but instead went to fraudulent applicants and Hockridge's own enrichment. Hockridge was released after sentencing with an ankle monitor and given a deadline to self-report to prison. That deadline is December 30th, 2025, coming up in just days. She's been ordered to report to Federal Prison Camp Bryan in Texas. This is a minimum security facility, often referred to as a club fed, because conditions are relatively comfortable compared to higher security prisons. But it's still prison. It's still 10 years of her life behind bars. And Federal Prison Camp Bryan has some notable inmates. Ghislaine Maxwell, Jeffrey Epstein's co-conspirator, is serving her sentence there. Elizabeth Holmes, the Theranos fraudster who deceived investors out of hundreds of millions, is there. And Jen Shah, the Real Housewives of Salt Lake City star who ran a telemarketing fraud scheme, is serving time there. Hockridge will be joining this population of high-profile female white-collar criminals. Her husband, Nathan Rice, took a plea deal earlier in the process. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud and is awaiting his own sentencing. It's likely he'll receive significant prison time as well, though possibly less than Hockridge since he cooperated with prosecutors. During the trial and sentencing, Hockridge's defense attorneys maintained that Blue Acorn was a sincere effort to support small businesses during the pandemic. They argued that the government's case focused on a small number of problematic loans out of the hundreds of thousands Blue Acorn processed. But prosecutors painted a different picture, one of greed, systematic fraud, and exploitation of a national crisis for personal enrichment. The evidence spoke for itself. Altered documents, fabricated payroll records, explicit instructions to prioritize paying clients over legitimate applicants, coaching borrowers on how to commit fraud, taking $300 million in fees while processing $63 million in fraudulent loans. This wasn't about helping small businesses. This was about getting rich off taxpayer money during a pandemic. $63 million in pandemic relief fraud is staggering. But we started this video with a case that dwarfs even that. It's time to circle back to Janet Yamanaka Mello and reveal the full story of how a trusted Army employee pulled off the largest theft in San Antonio history. Case #7. Janet Yamanaka Mello. Remember Janet Yamanaka Mello from the beginning of this video? The woman whose world collapsed on August 29th, 2023? Now let me tell you the full story of the empire she built on stolen money. At 57 years old, Janet Mello and her husband Mark had accumulated wealth that most people can't even imagine. They owned 31 properties across 5 states. Not rental units or investment condos, we're talking about substantial real estate holdings with a combined estimated value of $23 million. Properties in San Antonio, where Janet worked, properties in Denver, Colorado, properties in Canyon Lake, Texas, and scattered across the country, a portfolio of land and buildings purchased with money that wasn't theirs. But the crown jewel, the property that truly showed how far Janet's scheme had gone, was a 58-acre estate in Preston, Maryland. This wasn't a vacation home, this was a compound. The main house alone was 9,300 square feet. 8 bedrooms, 12 bathrooms, the kind of place where you could host your entire extended family and still have empty rooms. And the property included multiple garages specifically designed to house their vehicle collection. Because Janet and Mark didn't just own a few cars, they owned over 80 vehicles and motorcycles, vintage cars, luxury sedans, motorcycles, a fleet that required multiple buildings just to store them all. Then there was the jewelry. Janet Yamanaka Mello owned over 1,500 pieces of jewelry, designer pieces, high-end gems, custom work, and here's the detail that really captures the excess. On December 4th, 2022, less than a year before federal agents would raid her home, Janet walked into a jewelry store and spent $923,000 in a single day. Not $923, $923,000. In one shopping trip, she spent what most families earn in a decade. This was the lifestyle of someone who appeared to have unlimited resources. Private estates, luxury vehicles, million-dollar jewelry hauls, multiple properties as investment holdings or vacation getaways. And all of it, every property, every car, every piece of jewelry was purchased with money stolen from the United States Army. Money that was supposed to help military families and their children. Janet Yamanaka Mello worked as a financial program manager for the U.S. Army's Installation Management Command at Joint Base San Antonio Fort Sam Houston. Specifically, she worked in the G9 section, the department responsible for morale, welfare, and recreation services for soldiers and their families. Her job involved helping run the 4-H Military Partnership Grant Program. For those unfamiliar, 4-H is a youth development organization that encourages children to take on hands-on projects in agriculture, science, health, and civic leadership. It's been around for over a century and has served millions of American children. The Military Partnership Program was designed to bring 4-H services to children from military families, kids whose parents were serving in the Army, often deployed overseas or stationed far from home. These are families that sacrifice a lot for their country, and programs like this were meant to give their children opportunities for growth and community. Janet's bosses gave her almost complete autonomy over this program. There were minimal checks and balances, they trusted her, she'd worked for the Army for decades, 35 years of service. She had an excellent reputation, there was no reason to suspect she'd be stealing. In December of 2016, Janet created a business. She called it Child Health and Youth Lifelong Development, CHI-LD. On paper, Child D provided 4-H services to military personnel and their families. Janet submitted all the proper documentation to register the business. She set up a UPS store mailbox for CALD to receive official correspondence. And then she began submitting grant requests to the 4-H Military Partnership Grant Program, the program she herself managed. Think about what that means. Janet was in charge of approving grants for organizations that provided services to military families. She created a fake organization, submitted grant applications on behalf of that fake organization, and then approved her own fraudulent requests. She was on both sides of the transaction. She was essentially writing herself checks from the U.S. Treasury. The paperwork she submitted claimed that KLD was providing educational services, youth development programs, and support for military children. But federal authorities would later determine that KLD provided zero services. Not inadequate services, not poorly executed programs, zero. The company existed only to receive grant money, and once that money arrived, it went directly into Janet's personal bank account. Here's how the mechanics worked. Janet would prepare fraudulent grant applications claiming KLD needed funding for specific programs benefiting military families. The applications would go through the approval process which she controlled, and then the Defense Finance and Accounting Service would issue a check. The check would be mailed to KLD's UPS store mailbox. Janet would pick up the check, deposit it into her personal bank account, and immediately start spending it on properties, vehicles, and jewelry. She repeated this process 49 times over 6 years, 49 separate fraudulent grant requests. In total, she requested approximately $117 million. The Defense Finance and Accounting Service issued payments totaling approximately $108.9 million. $108.9 million stolen from the U.S. Army. Money that Congress had appropriated specifically to help children from military families. Money that taxpayers contributed believing it would support the families of soldiers serving overseas. Money that was supposed to fund real programs with real benefits. Instead, that money went to Janet's shopping sprees. It went to purchasing a 58-acre Maryland estate. It went to building a collection of 80 luxury vehicles. It went to accumulating 1,500 pieces of jewelry, including $900,000 single-day purchases. While military families struggled with the challenges of deployment, relocation, and serving their country, Janet Yamanaka Mello was living like royalty on money stolen from their children's programs. What brought Janet Mello down wasn't a whistleblower. It wasn't a victim complaint. It wasn't even an army audit, at least not initially. It was the IRS. The Internal Revenue Service noticed something that should have been obvious to anyone paying attention. Janet's reported income was nowhere near enough to support the lifestyle she was living. She was a GS federal employee. Her salary was public information. Financial program managers in the federal government make decent money, but they don't make Maryland estate, 80 vehicle collection, $1 million jewelry spree money. The IRS started asking questions. Where was this wealth coming from? How was she affording this lifestyle? As IRS criminal investigation dug deeper, they realized the income discrepancy wasn't just suspicious, it was impossible to explain without unreported income. They expanded their investigation, bringing in Army Criminal Investigation Division agents. When auditors started looking at the 4-H Military Partnership Grant Program, the fraud became obvious. Child was receiving millions in grants but providing no services. The company's only address was a UPS store mailbox, and the checks were being deposited into Janet Mello's personal accounts. By 2023, federal investigators had built an overwhelming case. On August 29, 2023, the date I mentioned at the beginning of this video, federal agents executed a search warrant at Janet's home on the far north side of San Antonio. They seized records, computers, financial documents. They began the process of identifying and freezing her assets, her properties, her vehicles, her jewelry collection. The $18 million in cash they found across 6 different bank accounts. Janet was allowed to retire from her army position and begin collecting her pension. Apparently, federal employment rules prevented the army from stopping her retirement even after the raid, but everyone knew what was coming. In December of 2023, a federal grand jury indicted Janet Yamanaka Mello. The charges were extensive: 5 counts of mail fraud because she'd used the US Postal Service to receive the fraudulent grant checks, and 5 counts of filing false tax returns because she'd failed to report the millions of dollars in stolen income on her tax filings for multiple years. In March of 2024, facing overwhelming evidence, Janet took a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to all 10 charges. There would be no trial, no jury, no chance to claim misunderstanding or accidental paperwork errors. She admitted to everything. On July 23, 2024, Janet Yamanaka Mello appeared in federal court in San Antonio for sentencing. The courtroom was packed with media, federal officials, and some representatives from military family advocacy groups, people who understood that this wasn't just a financial crime, but a betrayal of the families who serve. Federal prosecutors requested a sentence of 235 months, that's just under 20 years in federal prison. They argued that Janet's crime wasn't just about the dollar amount. Though $108.9 million was staggering, it was about who she stole from: military families, children of soldiers. Programs designed to support people who sacrifice for their country. The prosecutors argued that someone who would exploit these families deserved the maximum punishment. Janet's defense attorney, Albert Flores, argued for leniency. He presented character witnesses. He talked about her decades of federal service before the fraud began. He tried to paint a picture of someone who'd made terrible mistakes but wasn't a fundamentally bad person. Janet herself gave a statement. Fighting back emotion, she told the court, "After all of my actions that were unlawful, foolish, and just irrational, I have really tarnished the good reputation that I have worked for all my life. I will forever be sorry, and I will continue to work to make things right." U.S. District Judge Xavier Rodriguez listened to both sides. Then he handed down his sentence. 180 months in federal prison. That's 15 years. Janet Yamanaka Mello, at 57 years old, was sentenced to spend the next decade and a half behind bars. Given good behavior and federal sentencing guidelines, she'll likely serve about 13 years. She won't be released until she's in her 70s. But the sentence was just the beginning of the consequences. Judge Rodriguez ordered her to pay over $140 million in restitution. That includes the $108.9 million she stole, plus additional amounts for the extra payroll taxes the army incurred because of her fraud, plus penalties and interest. She's jointly liable with any co-conspirators, though it appears she acted alone, which somehow makes it even more remarkable that one person could steal this much. All 31 of her properties were forfeited to the government. Every single one of the 80+ vehicles and motorcycles gone, auctioned off, proceeds going to victims. The 1,500 pieces of jewelry seized and liquidated. The $18 million in cash found in 6 bank accounts frozen and transferred to the government. Everything Janet and Mark accumulated over 6 years of fraud was taken away. But there was one more financial battle. After her sentencing, Janet was allowed to keep her federal pension while awaiting transfer to prison. She'd worked for the government for 35 years and her monthly pension was $4,474. In October of 2024, federal prosecutors filed a motion asking the court to seize 95% of that pension to apply toward restitution. Janet's attorneys fought it. They argued she needed that money for basic expenses, commissary, and possibly to support family members. But prosecutors argued that taxpayers were already paying roughly $50,000 per year to house her in federal prison. She didn't need 95% of a pension paid for by the same government she'd robbed. Judge Rodriguez sided with the prosecutors. He ordered that 95% of Janet's monthly pension, about $4,251, would be seized and applied to restitution. She'd be allowed to keep 5%, about $224 per month, for commissary purchases while incarcerated. Even in prison, she'll be paying back what she stole. U.S. Attorney Jaime Esparza said it perfectly in his statement. Janet Mello betrayed the trust of the government agency she served and repeatedly lied in an effort to enrich herself. Rather than $109 million in federal funds going to the care of military children throughout the world, she selfishly stole that money to buy extravagant houses, more than 80 vehicles, and over 1,500 pieces of jewelry. Her actions reflect exactly the opposite of what it means to serve your country, and my office will continue to work tirelessly to prosecute those who illegally seek personal gain at the expense of their fellow citizens. Today, Janet Yamanaka Mello is serving her 15-year sentence in federal prison. The Maryland estate with 8 bedrooms and 12 bathrooms has been sold. The 80 vehicles have been auctioned. The jewelry collection has been liquidated. The properties across 5 states belong to other people now, and Janet wakes up every morning in a prison cell, stripped of everything she bought with stolen money. She went from living in a 9,000 square foot mansion to a cell probably smaller than one of her walk-in closets. She went from spending $923,000 on jewelry in a single day to having $224 per month for commissary. She went from unlimited resources to complete dependence on the federal prison system, and somewhere out there are the military families whose children never got the programs they were supposed to receive. Families who believed their tax dollars were supporting youth development for kids whose parents serve in uniform. Families who trusted that the government would take care of them while they took care of the nation. Those families were betrayed by Janet Yamanaka Mello, and no amount of prison time will ever fully make that right. If you found this deep dive valuable, do me a favor, hit that like button. It helps the algorithm show this content to more people who are interested in true crime and white-collar fraud cases, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We cover cases like this regularly, the crimes that don't always make headlines, but reveal something important about trust, power, and consequences. If you're not in support of what happened to these victims and you wish for perpetrators like these to face justice, make sure to follow this channel as a form of support. By subscribing and staying engaged, you help us highlight more cases like these and bring attention to the people who've been wronged by those in positions of power and trust. Drop a comment below and let me know. Which case shocked you the most? Was it Janet Mello's $100 million military theft? Stephanie Hockridge's pandemic relief fraud? The Judge couple's renovation scam that left 40 families with destroyed homes? I read every comment, and your feedback helps me decide which cases to cover next. If you want to see more content like this, check out the playlist linked in the description. We've got deep dives into other white-collar crimes, fraud schemes, and cases where people in positions of trust betrayed everyone who depended on them. There's also a playlist on financial crimes, specifically Ponzi schemes, embezzlement cases, and frauds that reveal how easily trust can be weaponized. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.